My name is Heidi Matson, and I'm a discussion group coordinator and a member of the Student Advisory Board here at the Dole Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program. Discussion groups are made possible by the Newman Zone Foundation, and we'd like to thank the Dolph Simons Family Fund for sponsoring Jerry's residency. Today's program will be live streamed and available on our YouTube channel. We are also excited that C-SPAN is going to be broadcasting this session. You can also access videos of past Dole Institute programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. After the program, we will have some time for audience questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. For virtual viewers, please send your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. Please ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind, and just ask one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Fall Fellow Jerry Seib.
Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. Sorry about the cold weather. We're here because with the controversy over President Trump's refusal to accept the results of the 2020 presidential election results, our country's entered some unprecedented territory. Questions of voter registration, access to the ballot, and public trust in election results are on the radar screen in a way they've never been before in our lifetimes. In a sense, one of the questions on the midterm ballot this fall is how our democracy itself will weather these storms. We're here to discuss all that today with a true expert on these issues. Sean Morales-Doyle is director of the Voting Rights Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, which has done extensive work in this area. Sean is a seasoned litigator with experience in civil rights and constitutional matters, and also has handled a wide variety of labor and employment cases. Sean got his undergraduate and law degrees from Northwestern University, and later served as an assistant attorney general for the state of Illinois. Sean, thanks for being here. So a lot has happened since Election Day 2020. Let's start with voter access. Your center issued a report just a couple of weeks ago showing that between January of 2021 and last month, at least 21 states enacted 42 laws that restricted access to voting in some way. Of those, 33 of those laws are in effect for the midterms that are happening in a couple of weeks. So what shape do these laws take, and how will they affect the process we're about to go through as a country?
The shape that they take varies from state to state. Not all of these laws are the same, but there are some trends. The majority of these new restrictive laws target mail voting and put restrictions on voting by mail. I think that is a reaction and a demonstration and an illustration of the fact that many of these laws are a reaction to the 2020 election. In 2020, as many of you probably know, we saw a shift towards a lot more mail voting because we were in the height of the coronavirus pandemic, and many voters felt less comfortable coming to the polls and voting in person. And so many states expanded access to mail voting in 2020, and many people took advantage of that. And I think in large part because people were able to access voting by mail and other forms of voting in 2020, we saw record turnout in 2020, more than we had seen in a century of presidential elections. That was that turnout happened for a lot of reasons, but I think it was possible because of the access that voters had to options like mail voting. And rather than seeing the response to that massive turnout being a celebration, that we had Americans participating in our democracy like never before, unfortunately, we've seen a bit of a backlash. That backlash has been animated by lies about the vulnerability of our mail voting system to fraud, about the 2020 election supposedly having been rigged. And it has motivated this spate of new restrictions, many of which are aimed at mail voting. Not all of which are aimed at mail voting. There are plenty of other restrictions as well, but I think that's where the primary focus has been. What effect it will have in 2022 is hard to know for sure. But we've already seen some clear examples of the effect that it might have. Perhaps the best example, the most sort of clear example of the kind of effect one of these provisions can have with regard to mail voting is in Texas. Texas is among the states that passed these restrictive laws. In 2021, Texas passed a bill called SB1, which is really an omnibus bill that contains many, many restrictions on voting. One of those, just one of those many restrictions, is a new rule in Texas that you have to put either your driver's license number or the last four digits of your social security number on both your mail ballot application when you apply to vote by mail and on your ballot when you return your mail ballot. I think that requirement sounds at first blush like not that big of a hurdle to clear, either putting down your driver's license number or the last four of your social security number. But it resulted in thousands and thousands of applications being rejected in the March primary alone. And the reasons why are many. One is the way this works is you put down your number, you mail in your application, and that number is matched up with your voter registration record. And if it doesn't match, then your application's rejected. But if you registered to vote using your driver's license number, and when you fill out your mail ballot application, you put down the last four of your social security number, no match, ballot gets rejected. Vice versa, same problem. Or if you registered a while back when you didn't have to put either of those things down, then you won't have either number in your registration record, application gets rejected. On the mail ballot that you fill out, on the envelope is where you put down this number, but that can't be on the outside of the envelope for everyone to see, so it's underneath the flap to keep it private, and a lot of people just frankly missed it. So the way these things work, I think, is not always obvious to people, but just that one little restriction that at first sounds like it's not that much literally led to thousands of people's votes being rejected in just the March primary. So that can give you a taste of what it will look like when we have many, many provisions, many, many laws across the country in November. Not all of them are going to have that severe of an impact. Some of them will be less than that. But when these restrictions are layered on top of one another, restriction after restriction, and voters are having to adjust to new rules that they didn't have to follow just one election ago, I think we could see serious impacts. And I'll just finish by saying it won't always come in the form of voters being rejected and outright disenfranchised. Some of it is just about the costs that are imposed on voters when they're trying to exercise their fundamental right to vote. And that means that there is a lot of work that has to be done to help people clear those hurdles. So they may end up clearing them, but all of the work that could be done to just turn out the vote and get people engaged and see that turnout like we saw in 2020, so much of that now has to go towards just helping people clear these hurdles. And we should care about that too, both because it ultimately detracts from just getting people excited about voting, but because I think if someone waits in line for 8 hours to vote, they may be willing to do it. We shouldn't be okay with the fact that they have to. And even if they're willing to do it this time, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be willing to next time. And in fact, that going through that experience this time may have a real effect in elections down the road.
But let me offer the devil's advocate argument here. So I think what people advocating these laws would say is that it was necessary to respond to what happened in 2020 when election procedures were changed on the fly to some extent in many places because of the need to hold a national election during a pandemic, and that the changes that were made were not thought out, were not systematic, and there was a need to tighten up the process, and that's a logical and understandable reaction to what happened in 2020. Are they wrong in saying that?
I would say, by and large, yes, they are wrong. And part of the reason why is that most of these restrictions aren't what you're describing there. Texas didn't rapidly expand mail voting in 2020. Some states did. Texas did not. It has one of the most restrictive mail voting systems in the country. It did in 2020. It does now. And they just added more restrictions on top of those restrictions. And there wasn't a problem with people returning ballots for someone other than themselves. So many of these restrictions are aimed at solving a problem that didn't exist. We actually looked at the litigation that followed the 2020 election, and I think probably many people have heard now as a result of the January 6th committee hearings and otherwise that there were some 60 lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and by allies to try to resist the outcome of the presidential election, and they didn't go anywhere because by and large, for the most part, they were entirely baseless. But they put forward these conspiracy theories that have now turned into widespread disinformation about the election, and we traced those conspiracy theories through to the restrictive legislation that was being introduced in 2021 to see how many times when a conspiracy theory was pushed forward in a state in 2020, do we see legislation in that state introduced in 2021 that seems to be addressing that conspiracy theory? And it was quite prevalent in almost every state where this litigation was happening. We saw those kinds of problems, so-called problems, being addressed in the legislation in 2021. So they're not. So many of these bills are not addressing real gaps in the system. They're addressing problems that were made up in an attempt to resist the outcome of the 2020 election. I do think that there are ways that our election system can be improved. I just don't think most of these new restrictive laws are actually aimed at doing that.
Well, I mean, how would you describe the extent and character of the voter fraud problem in the country? How much of it is there really, and what form does it tend to take?
Well, I think we so often hear the word voter fraud, and I think people use that to describe many different things. I'll say voter fraud is vanishingly rare, almost never happens, and certainly does not happen at a rate that is going to impact the outcome of major elections like a presidential election. But we do sometimes see misconduct in elections. It doesn't tend to be voters that are engaged in it. Sometimes political campaigns do bad things. I think maybe the most prominent example of this in recent memory was in North Carolina in 2018. A candidate for Congress, his campaign was tampering with people's mail ballots, and that is a problem. But it's also a good example of the fact that when people do things like that, they get caught, they get prosecuted. That election outcome was not certified because of this misconduct. We actually do have a lot of checks in our system to ensure that people can't get away with that kind of thing. And so occasionally someone in a position of power, a political candidate, engages in misconduct. Even that is fairly rare. But the idea that there's some sort of widespread conspiracy among voters to cast ballots in someone else's name or cast ballots when they're ineligible, that is extraordinarily rare. And it makes sense that it is, because the sort of calculus doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Going and casting one ballot for somebody else when that's a felony offense that you are likely to get caught for and prosecuted, it doesn't. What's the motivation? You're not really going to change the outcome of an election that way, and instead you're just going to put yourself in a serious risk of prosecution.
Yeah. Let me ask you to address one law, just as a case study, that attracted a lot of attention shortly after the 2020 election, which is the Georgia law, which did restrict voter access in some ways, but its proponents argue, for example, that was overstated. It makes registering to vote harder in some ways, but also requires drop boxes for early ballots, expands the early voting period, and simply reduces the window for requesting an early ballot from 6 months down to 3 months. So it's not that bad. What's your reaction to those set of arguments?
I think that some of what happened in the way that legislation was crafted is that they, it mandates drop boxes, but it limits how many of them that you can have in a particular county. So then you can say, well, we're mandating drop boxes, we're expanding access. But the reality is, in these large counties, the number of drop boxes is dwindling down from a very large amount to a small amount. And so some of this is kind of semantics and people playing games with the pieces they want to highlight. And so, the pieces you highlighted then leave out something like the line warming ban. It makes it a criminal offense to provide people with water or snacks while they're waiting in lines in a state that has a long history of very long lines, unfortunately. And it is also true that there is a difference between deciding not to expand access to voting and restricting access to voting. And what I mean by that is a state that decides that they're going to keep their 30-day period for applying for a ballot rather than expanding it is probably doing less harm than a state that had a 60-day period and cuts it down to 30. Voters get used to the way that they're able to cast their ballot. They get used to the rules. Taking away early voting is going to have more of a negative impact than deciding not to offer more early voting, if that makes sense. So I do think that those restrictions matter, even if Georgia started from a more expansive position. But I also think what's interesting about the SB 202 in Georgia is Georgia has had a fairly expansive mail voting system for a long time. Far more expansive than where I live in New York, and more expansive than many of its neighbors, in that anybody could cast a ballot by mail. And that's not true everywhere in the country, certainly not in Texas. And nobody seemed to have a problem with it until 2020, when a lot more voters started using mail voting and a different set of voters started using mail voting. There was a major shift in that, both in the partisan makeup of who was voting by mail, but also the demographics. Far more black voters relied on mail voting in 2020 in Georgia than ever had before. And the response was, that's where we're going to restrict access to mail voting. Making it more painful to wait on long lines, it's not good for anybody, but research, including our research, has demonstrated that voters of color are much more likely to wait on long lines. So these restrictions seem to be targeting the voting of certain communities. There was a proposal in Georgia that ended up not making it into the law because of how much of a reaction it received, to get rid of voting on Sundays. That matters in Georgia because there's a long history of black communities using Sunday voting through Souls to the Polls initiatives. A lot of black churches use Souls to the Polls initiatives in Georgia to get people out to the polls on Sundays. So targeting Sunday voting is a very particular choice. That's why the Department of Justice is suing Georgia for intentional race discrimination for passing SB 202. But I also just want to say that I think, as I said before about this Texas law, some of these restrictions may not on their face sound so imposing to people, but part of what is happening here, the way restrictions work on voting in 2022, it's not the same as the way that this happened, in the Jim Crow era. These aren't the blunt tools of that era, just, disenfranchising wide swaths of the community. There are fortunately still examples of that, like felony disenfranchisement, for instance. But more often than not, it's what we sometimes talk about, death by 1,000 cuts. It's little restrictions layered on top of restrictions on top of restrictions, and the way that those interact with one another, it often creates this sort of Byzantine system for people to navigate in order to cast a ballot. And it doesn't disenfranchise everybody, but it knocks enough people out here and enough people out there.
One of the other things that's happened is there have been changes in the way elections are certified, and who decides the winner, who declares the winner, who certifies the results. And that was perhaps an equally controversial part of the Georgia law, for example, and in other places. What is going to be different, and does anything about that process worry you about this year's midterm elections? Who's going to decide who won and who lost?
I'm not so worried about that for 2022, but there's some caveats to that. I am worried about that a little bit for 2024. We did see in addition to, so you referenced earlier this study about the restrictive laws passed around the country. The Brennan Center has for over a decade now tracked every piece of state legislation in every state legislature affecting voting rights. And we've historically always categorized those as either restrictive laws, expansive laws, or neutral laws. They either restrict access to voting, make it harder to vote, expand access to voting, make it easier to vote, or they are just changes to the rules and they don't necessarily do either of those things. And we did see this unprecedented wave of restrictive legislation in 2021 and 2022, and frankly also of expansive legislation, just that tended to be in different states. But in 2021, for the first time, we saw this new category of legislation that we didn't have a name for, that was aimed at changing, like you said, the sort of process for how elections work. And it didn't necessarily make it harder to vote, but it might change who's in control of the count. It may create a higher risk of partisan actors playing a role in the administration of elections. And so this year, for the first time, we comprehensively tracked that in our voting rights tracker, our roundup. And we actually saw just as many what we now call election interference laws passed in 2022 as restrictive laws. And so that does give me concern. But I will say the worst of those laws haven't passed. So there was a bill introduced in Arizona that would have just given the Arizona state legislature the power to reject the outcome of elections. That's crazy. And the Arizona leadership in the legislature agrees, and they didn't let that bill get anywhere. They referred it to every single legislative committee so that it wouldn't go anywhere. But this bill, SB1 in Texas, the predecessor to that, which came literally hours from passing, SB7, it only didn't pass because the Democrats in the Texas legislature walked out, broke quorum, and killed the bill, basically. It contained a provision that was called overturning election. That was the title written into the bill. And it would have given judges, partisan judges, the power to reject the outcome of election, even without proof that there was an issue that should have called into question the outcome of the election. And the next day, after the Democrats walked out and broke quorum, the legislators who were responsible for this bill started backtracking and disclaiming, we don't know how that made it in there. We never would have supported anything like that. Of course, an entire house of the legislature had already voted for it, so they did, in fact, support something like that. But I think they realized just how bad that it looked, and maybe some of them didn't realize it was in this bill. So those most terrifying changes to the rules haven't passed. The ones that we have seen pass, the election interference legislation that we have seen pass, sort of tweak the system in more indirect ways. One of them is Senate Bill 202 in Georgia, and a number of other Georgia laws that change who's in control of county elections administration. Some counties, they change it in a way that makes election administration more partisan. And then at the state level, they give the state board the power to remove county election officials. That is a concern because of the risk that it creates for somebody to do something wrong in the future. What's troubling about 2024 is that now we see many people running for office to be election officials, to be the people that run elections, who themselves deny the outcome of the last election and say some pretty scary things about future elections. If the people who run our elections don't believe in democracy, then we're in a scary place.
I would obviously want to come back to that, but before we do, I want to make note of one thing you referred to briefly, which I think has gone unnoticed here, which is that there have been some states that have done the opposite. They've actually expanded access to voting. I think your report said at least 12 states have enacted 19 laws that expand access to the vote. Where is that happening, and what is its meaning for this year's election?
It's happening in a lot of places. Unfortunately, as I said before, there's not often overlap between who's expanding access and who's restricting access. And so we have these divergent trends in different parts of the country that are making it so that your access to the ballot increasingly depends on where you live in the country. And that's a problem. We have at the Brennan Center been involved in a lot of work over the last few years to try to get bills passed to expand access to voting. We push for things like automatic voter registration and restoring voting rights to people with convictions in their past, and same-day registration. And, so we've seen bills doing all of those things passing. Unfortunately, we have seen that voting rights has become an increasingly partisan issue. And so a lot of times where these bills pass depends on which party is running the state legislature. And that's why you're seeing different trends in different parts of the country. But I will say it's not entirely about party. And we have done some research on where we're seeing restrictive laws introduced that we can talk about in a minute. But before talking about that, I would say to your question about what impact will it have on this election, many more of the expansive laws take time to implement, or the people who pass them acknowledge that they take time to implement. So when we advocate for a state to adopt automatic voter registration, for instance, we don't push for that to go into effect like that. We want to make sure that it's done right and done well. And so, when New York passed an automatic voter registration law in 2020, the time horizon was that it will go into effect in the DMV in 2023 and in a number of other state agencies in 2024, to give all these agencies the opportunity to actually, do the work to make this thing happen. So fewer of those expansive laws are going to be in effect for the upcoming midterm elections than the restrictive laws are. But in some places, it was just codifying changes that were made in 2020 as a result of the pandemic and saying, actually, we really liked that everybody could vote by mail. We're going to keep that. And so a number of those will be in effect for the 2022 election, and I think it will help people sort of maintain the habits that they developed in 2020.
I would just note as an aside, there are several states that have had heavy vote by mail over some years where Republicans have done quite well. So there was a kind of a disconnect to some extent between the partisan arguments on that front and the witnessed reality of recent years.
Yes, I think 2020 was an aberration in the way mail voting worked in so many ways. But yeah, I do think historically the Republican Party had relied more on mail voting than the Democratic Party. And all of a sudden in 2020, you had the Republican Party sort of scaring its constituency away from voting by mail with all of this false rhetoric about fraud. And then you saw this shift. But it's also really hard to say how much of that shift in 2020 is going to stick. I think people were voting by mail for a very particular reason in 2020. And because of all of these restrictions, I also think that the political machinery is taking a different tack in 2022. Get out the vote campaigns are less likely to encourage people to vote by mail if they know that there's a hurdle that's going to trip them up on the way there.
Yeah. Let me pin you down on this point, though, specifically. Do you think we will see this year state legislatures step in and try to affect, change, or declare the outcome of an election?
State legislatures, no, I don't think so. I think that we have seen state legislature do some things to increase the possibility that someone else might do that.
Somebody else like
an election official, or like that they increase the possibility that some kind of disruption could be used as the basis for making, some poor decision. Yeah. So they've increased the likelihood of poll watchers engaging in intimidation, or they've scared election officials with new criminal offenses that they face. So we sued Texas over that same law. SB 1 included a provision that makes it a crime for election officials to solicit mail ballot applications. In other words, it's a crime for a nonpartisan election official in Texas to encourage someone to vote by mail. And that means that election officials have to worry that if they give people the right information about voting by mail, they can be accused of a crime. And that's just one of many examples of new crimes that folks face. So they sort of tilt the scales a little bit, or intimidate election officials a little bit, or create new election police, sometimes people call them. So they give other people the opportunity to interfere a little bit more than I expect a legislature to try to interfere
Well,
itself.
I ask that in part because you at the Brennan Center have warned about something called the independent state legislative theory being invoked. And
yes.
I would try to explain it, but you're the lawyer, not me, so I'll let you explain it, and then tell us why it's something you have pointed to as a cause of concern.
Yeah. So the independent state legislature theory is a complicated legal name for a radical legal theory that is being pressed before the U.S. Supreme Court right now that basically would remove many of the checks and balances that currently exist on state legislatures when they regulate elections. So I think any of us that sort of had civics education understands the way that state governments work. State legislatures pass laws. Governors can veto them or approve them. State courts can strike them down if they violate state constitutions. And in many states, the people can enact laws through ballot initiatives, constitutional amendments. that can also restrain the legislatures. That legislatures aren't all powerful. They have a lot of checks on them. And what the independent state legislature theory says is not when it comes to elections. Now, when it comes to federal elections, state legislatures get to do basically whatever they want. State courts can't say anything about it. State constitutions can't say anything about it. State governors can't say anything about it. Election officials don't really have a say in this. It's just the state legislatures. And that's as crazy as it sounds. It has no basis in 200 years of courts interpreting the Constitution. It doesn't have a basis in history. It's not what the framers intended.
But it was advanced in the 2000 argument about that election.
It was referenced in the Bush v. Gore opinion. So I guess I shouldn't say it doesn't come completely out of the blue. But the Bush v. Gore court also did not fully embrace this. This is not the law now. It would only be the law if the Supreme Court decides to make it the law.
And explain the case before the Supreme Court where this is at issue.
Yeah, so this has come up in a case out of North Carolina where the North Carolina legislature engaged in a partisan gerrymander. They drew the lines for the districts in North Carolina in a way that clearly benefited the majority party, the Republicans. And both parties are guilty of doing this in many states around the country. And the U.S. Supreme Court has basically washed their hands of this and said, we're not going to do anything about it. But when they did that a couple years ago, they said, but states can do something about it. If states want to restrain partisan redistricting, if state courts think it violates state constitutions, they can do something about it. And that's exactly what the North Carolina Supreme Court did. The North Carolina Supreme Court said this partisan gerrymander violates the North Carolina Constitution. We're striking it down. And the legislators responsible for that map appealed it to the United States Supreme Court and said, the North Carolina courts don't get to tell us whether we violate the North Carolina Constitution. When we're regulating federal elections, there's no check on us. And they're asking the Supreme Court to endorse that view, to say that even if the North Carolina Constitution bans partisan gerrymandering and the North Carolina court decides that's exactly what you did here, but they can't say anything about it and the partisan gerrymander will remain in place. And that's exactly what this would mean for any state legislature enacting a law about federal elections if the court were to adopt this theory.
Do you want to venture a guess, a prediction about what the current Supreme Court is going to think of that argument?
I don't like to predict what the Supreme Court will do, but what I will say is there are definitely some members of the Supreme Court that have in the past suggested that they would embrace this theory. So there's real reason to be worried that they will adopt it. That said, I think there's been a lot of advocacy done and still to be done before the court to show them just what a terrible decision that would be and how chaotic it would be, including from some, folks that I think people might not expect. A conference of all of the chief justices of the state Supreme Courts around the country filed an amicus brief in the case to say, don't do this. That is not, I think people often think about these issues as purely partisan issues, that this is like a Republican court trying to stop Democrats or help Republicans or something like that. The chief justices of the state Supreme Courts around this country are not a particularly left-leaning group. Many of them, including the leadership, are Republicans. We're talking about the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, right? Coming to the U.S. Supreme Court saying, you can't do this. And they're saying it because they know the important role that Supreme Courts play, state Supreme Courts play. And I think that I think that there's real hope that advocacy like that and many other amicus briefs that I expect will be filed next week in this case will show the court just what a dangerous road that they're going down.
It raises a broader question, which is what the attitudes of the courts, generally speaking, has been about the issues we've been talking about, particularly about voter access, but also regulation of elections and the election process. Again, you're a lawyer. Some of this is going to be hashed out in the political arena, but some of it's going to be hashed out in the legal arena.
Yeah.
Is there a pattern in the courts that's emerged?
Yes, unfortunately, a very negative pattern in my view. The federal courts have essentially retreated from the protection of voting rights. I don't want to say entirely, but definitely have retreated from their former role. For a long time, the federal courts served this role as the protector of voting rights. So many of the important decisions around voting rights over the years have come from the federal courts enforcing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And for a long time, that was there was widespread agreement both among lawmakers and on the court for the important role that the court played there. I think, here we are in the Dole Institute. I was mentioning to someone earlier, Senator Dole played a very important role in amending the Voting Rights Act in 1982 to make clear that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act didn't require proving racially discriminatory intent to challenge a law. It just required showing that a law would produce discriminatory results. This was a bipartisan effort, always, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Just last year, looking at those amendments from 1982 that Bob Dole was played such an important role in getting done, the Supreme Court seriously hampered the ability to do just what they were trying to do, to challenge a law because it produced racially discriminatory results. And that was the last in a long series of decisions the Supreme Court has engaged in over the last decade that make it much harder to protect voting rights in federal courts. In 2013, the court famously basically nullified a different part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that required pre-clearance of changes to voting in parts of the country with a history of race discrimination. That made it more incumbent on advocates to bring affirmative suits to try to challenge discriminatory provisions. And then last year in this decision, they made it harder to do that. In the meantime, there's been a series of what we call shadow docket decisions by the Supreme Court, where they're not actually ruling on a case, on the merits. They're not issuing an opinion. They're just making decisions on sort of procedural issues. So they kind of fly under the radar a lot. People don't realize what the court's doing. That's why we call it the shadow docket. And through those decisions, they've used this, they've sort of distorted this principle, which is sometimes called the Purcell principle. They've distorted this principle that says courts shouldn't change the rules to an election right before an election. That's confusing. Even if a law violates the Constitution, you shouldn't change it right before an election because that'll just cause more chaos than it's worth. And the court has expanded that so dramatically that now it is, 5 months before a primary election, the federal courts are saying you can't strike down that law as unconstitutional because we're too close to an election. So in February, we're too close to the election. And that means that when states pass these laws in 2021, there's very little hope of getting federal courts to intervene and stop them from going into effect before 2022. That's why we have so many of these laws that will be in effect in 2022. We're suing to challenge laws in Texas. People are suing to challenge that law in Georgia. There are people suing to challenge the law in Florida. None of them are going to see a final decision in time for the 2022 election. And we're all fighting an uphill battle in all of those lawsuits. So we can no longer rely on the federal courts to play that protective role. And that's really a concern. If they were to adopt the independent state legislature theory, then we also couldn't count on state courts to play that role. And then we really start to lose so many of the checks on state legislatures that we used to have. And that's why I'm really worried about 2024 and what might happen if state legislatures are sort of left to run amok. And I think we should all be worried about that because it isn't the way our system was meant to function. It's not what Congress intended when they passed that law in 1965 and renewed it a number of times since. It's not what our Constitution intends. We like checks and balances. That's something we used to all sort of agree upon. And we should be really worried about a scenario where partisan politicians get to make decisions about how our elections are run, and there's no checks on that.
I do want to turn to you all for your questions, so be prepared. But let me ask you about that point finally before we turn to the audience, which is to say the 2024 election that looms out there. If you take all the things we've been discussing here, wrap them together, what does it all portend for 2024? And let me again put out a little bit of a devil's advocate argument there, that is it possible that if we get through this election and these changes have been made and everybody's had their say and the election comes out okay, that will be a good thing because then everybody will calm down and agree that we have a system that works.
Yes, I think that's possible. I guess I do want to. I realize a lot of what I've been saying up here is doom and gloom, and I don't want everybody to leave here feeling terrified. I am confident in our democracy. As someone who works on voting issues and issues affecting our democracy every day, I will say to all of you that I think we have a strong and resilient democracy in the United States. I think 2020 proved that to us. We saw unprecedented attacks on our democracy. We saw unprecedented attempts. We saw a armed insurrection on our Capitol. But we survived it. We saw a pandemic right before the election throw everything into disarray, and we saw election officials and legislators and governors respond in a way that allowed us to see record-breaking turnout during the height of that pandemic. We got through it, and it all functioned just fine. And I think we will get through it in 2022. And I do hope that will help people see that actually this system works, and we should believe in it, and that it can function again in 2024. But we all have a decision that we have to make collectively about that. The more people's faith in our democracy is undermined, the scarier the situation gets. Democracy only works if people believe in it. So I say all of these things about all of these new threats we face in order to say this is the problem we face that we need to address, not to say that we've already gone off the edge of the cliff. I think that we have to all collectively decide that we do want a democracy and to work very hard to protect it. So I want to sound the alarm without being alarmist, if that makes sense.
Well, there's plenty of public polling, which I looked at today, that suggests that confidence has been shaken, but we can get to that later if we want. I want to open it up to your questions. Will and Heidi both have microphones, and they'll be coming around. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll get to as many as I can. And if you want to submit a question online, if you're watching on YouTube, it's Dole Questions, one word, @ku.edu. If you have a question, I would ask you to stand up so we can all see you. And I would also remind you a question is exactly that. It is a question, not a speech, and it has a question mark at the end of the sentence. So raise your hand and we can start here, and we'll move around the room.
One thing that I've always struggled to understand about the 2020 election was there was like an attempt to exploit some either perceived ambiguity or ambiguity in the way that the Constitution states that the Electoral College votes are counted. Is that something that we should be scrambling to fix before the next presidential election, or was that just sort of a theory that was made up out of nothing that we don't need to address or revamp the law in any way to fix?
It's a great question. So I think the answer is maybe a little bit of both. Absolutely, this legal theory pushed by John Eastman most famously is bunk. It's made up out of whole cloth. It has no basis. And even he knew that. So I think some of the testimony we heard in the January 6th committee are people saying John Eastman admitted he's the architect of this idea that they could just, send fake electors and reject the electors sent by the states. He admitted that if he were ever in front of the Supreme Court making this argument, he would lose 9-0. This is a Supreme Court that, as I just said, has been retreating from the protection of voting rights. But I think even the people who have been pushing this theory acknowledge that that's a line that they're not willing to cross because it doesn't make any sense. The state legislatures shouldn't be able to change the rules for how elections work after the fact because they don't like the outcome. Nobody thinks the Electoral Count Act really works that way. But the Electoral Count Act, which is the law that implements the Constitution's requirements, was written a long time ago and not particularly well. So I do think there's room for improvement there, and Congress is actually on a bipartisan basis considering electoral count reform. I think that's a good thing. But I don't think it's necessary to stop what we saw trying to happen in 2020. I think it would be good to have clarity there because this has now become such a focal point. I certainly don't think reforming the Electoral Count Act is either necessary to protect against an attempt to overturn our elections, nor sufficient to push back against all of the threats that we face right now, which, as we've been talking about, go much further than John Eastman's crazy legal theory.
Just to pin you down on that, I assume you're in favor of the bipartisan electoral vote count reform.
Yes.
Amy Klobuchar and I think Roy Blunt are pushing it. Do you think that would be a good thing.
I think it would be a good thing. I just want to be clear that I think even if it didn't happen, what John Eastman was proposing cannot happen.
But even if it does happen, you think there's still room for some dispute on that front?
I think no. I think even if it does happen, there's still a lot more work to be done to protect our elections from the attempts to undermine them. In other words, that's one very specific, far-fetched threat. The one that we saw in 2020. It didn't get anywhere for a reason. It's one we need to be, preparing for. But there are many other ways that people are seeking to attack our democracy right now. And so I think Congress needs to do a whole lot more than pass Electoral Count Act reform. We were pushing Congress very hard to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which became one law together. The John R. Lewis Freedom to Vote Act came very, very close, didn't get across the finish line despite majority support because of the filibuster. That's what I think Congress really needs to do to fix all of our problems, but maybe not all of our problems. But
that would be a lot.
It would be helpful. But it's not to undermine the significance.
Just to be clear for everybody in the audience, the gist of the Electoral College Vote Act would be to make clear that the vice president doesn't have the power to come in and just say yes or no, we accept or don't accept those electoral votes.
Well, and it also just provides clarity on what happens if somebody challenges. Provide more sort of procedural clarity for how to address things going wrong.
Right. Okay. Further questions? Others?
This may be a little peripheral, but I was reading something the other day that was making an argument that paper ballots on a large scale might be preferable to the electronic systems as a means of helping to ensure that people place more trust in the outcomes. What's your perspective on that?
I think that as a matter of election security, it's really good for us to have either paper ballots or a paper trail. So there are accessibility reasons why we need to provide electronic systems for voters with disabilities, for example, and we can have electronic systems that function, but up until recently, unfortunately, there are many places in the country where those electronic systems didn't create a voter-verified paper record, and so everything was stored electronically. I do think it's important for us to at least have a paper record that a voter can verify and say, yes, that is my vote, for purposes of auditing the results of an election afterwards, if necessary. I think it gives all of us more confidence if there's a paper record, but that doesn't mean that every ballot necessarily has to be a paper ballot. So sort of maybe a mostly yes question. I think it's a good thing. I want to say that's different than there's a sort of push now, a fringe movement to require hand counting of those paper ballots. I don't think that is a good idea. I think hand counting can be a fail-safe on the back end during a recount kind of thing, but it will make elections virtually. It's much harder to administer a hand count, and the equipment that we have to optically scan paper ballots is fully up to the task. So, just to distinguish between those two.
But by and large, do people have a paper backup in most places right now?
Yes. Now, I think that has changed a lot in the last few years, but especially after many of us heard about attempts by foreign powers to meddle in our government in 2016. I think there was a big push with bipartisan funding from Congress to upgrade our election security, and a lot of that was to move away from these old DRE is what the acronym, but these old electronic systems that didn't have that paper backup. So by and large, I think people are voting with either a paper ballot or a paper trail in 2022.
Okay. Others? Right there.
Do you think lowering the voting age to 16 would be a good way to expand voting rights in the U.S. right now?
The Brennan Center does not take a position on that question, so I'm not going to endorse it or oppose it. I think it's an interesting question that I do think there's a bit of a movement developing I do think it's really important that we get people engaged in the democratic process as early as we can. And there are some reforms that don't go as far as letting 16-year-olds vote that help with that. So a number of states have started enacting pre-registration, so you can register to vote when you're 16, which helps when that's the age when people go get their driver's license. So you can get them registered to vote when they first sign up to get their driver's license, and then they'll be registered when they become of age. There are states that allow 16 and 7-year-olds to engage in the democratic process in other ways, to be poll workers, and I think that we see a lot less civic education in our schools these days than we once did. So it's really important to engage folks at that age so that they, that they're, when they go off on their own, move out of their parents' homes and go off to college, whatever, that they are already, see that as part of their job as citizens. So I think for all of those reasons, there's an interesting debate to be had about lowering the voting age, but we don't take a formal position on it one way or the other.
Go ahead.
In 2020, especially, and most recently in Kansas in the August primary, there have been numerous demands for recounts after election results were certified. Do you think that the optics of demands for election recounts overall make people more or less accepting of those election results?
That's a really good question. I think that a lot of states have automatic recounts if the margin is too narrow, or depending on the margin, they can. There's a sort of a presumption that you can get a recount if you want, and I think recounts do sometimes help ensure faith in the outcome of the elections. It makes people feel like we double checked, and they can play an important role. And sometimes mistakes can be found during a recount, So I think the idea of a recount can be helpful to ensuring public faith in elections. I think, unfortunately, we're at a moment right now when many of those calls for recounts are coming from not from a place of wanting to check the outcome, but from what have unfortunately become sort of widespread conspiracy theories about rigged elections. And so, if that's the starting point that people are coming from when they're making a call for a recount, they're unlikely to believe the outcome for the recount either. So at least for that population, I don't know that it's going to help. But I do think that I hope that, all of these sort of absurd partisan reviews that we saw of the outcomes of elections following 2020, that even those partisan reviews were completely unable to prove that there was any kind of fraud and weren't able to unearth anything. I hope that helps people see that there really is nothing afoot, but I'm worried that what it does is just helps people, like, it just reaffirms whatever narrative people already have in their head, right? So just hearing that there is a recount, hearing that there is an audit, or that there is a review, confirms for people whatever their worst fear is. There's a lot of evidence that when we talk about voter fraud, even if we're saying it's a myth, voter fraud's not real, that people just hear the words voter fraud, and it sort of helps reaffirm the fact that that's a thing. So I do worry that the more people question the outcome of elections, even if the answer after they question it is no, the outcome was right, that just the asking of that question over and over and over again with no basis undermines public faith more than it helps.
Others? David?
I heard our county clerk last night suggest that the problem with voter registration, voting, so forth, really comes down to the fact that we've never in our society resolved the question about whether voting is a right or a privilege. He says it's not even mentioned in the Constitution until the 14th Amendment. Would you agree? And if so, what do we do? Need another amendment to really establish that everybody has the right to vote?
I think Absolutely, there is a right to vote in the United States Constitution, and it's not true that it's not. It doesn't appear until the 14th Amendment, though it is true that it is not addressed sort of explicitly. But the fact that the House of Representatives is elected by the people, it was in the original Constitution. So I don't, and the guarantee of a Republican form of government and other, I think that, I don't think that we need clarification that there's a right to vote in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has acknowledged the right to vote many times. There's lots of case law about it. And Congress has enacted legislation to support the right to vote. I do think that the clerk's comment is still right in that I don't know that we as a nation all agree on how we perceive of the right to vote. I do think that there are people who view it as a privilege. I do think there are people who, view it on the other hand as not only a right but a responsibility. And I don't know that we're all in agreement on that. I think that's unfortunate because I do think it has always been the case that there's a right to vote in the Constitution. And unfortunately, it was a right that was not extended to everybody from the very beginning of our country. Our nation, when our nation was founded, it was just propertied white men that could vote. But fortunately, much of the history of our country has been a story of expanding the franchise to make it more universal. Expanding it through the Reconstruction Amendments and the 15th Amendment to black men, expanding it through the 19th Amendment to women, expanding it through the 24th Amendment and the 26th Amendment. We have repeatedly throughout our country moved in the right direction and made very clear that we want everybody to have access to voting. But it does seem that when we have these debates, that there's unfortunately some folks in the country that still don't seem to be bought into that idea. I think that's a problem, but I don't think the solution is a constitutional amendment because I think the Constitution already gives us that right. It's more of a question of changing people's hearts and minds, I suppose.
Had a conversation earlier this year with a former Prime Minister of Australia who described their system in which people are required to vote. Good idea or bad idea?
I think that, again, not a policy that the Brennan Center has taken an explicit position on, but I think we have a lot to learn from countries like Australia and many other countries in the world that do view voting, again, not only as a right, but as a responsibility. I think that turnout in elections in the United States is often dismal, and we've become far too used to that. But part of it is because we are still having this debate over who should be allowed to do it. So, the history of voting rights in this country, I think, is baffling to people in other countries often. The fact that we have for so long had these fights over whether it's okay to make it harder for people to vote is baffling to people. The fact that we deny people the right to vote because they were convicted of a crime, decades ago, and even though they're living next door to us, is baffling to people in other countries, because so much of our nation's history is about this fight over who we're going to let into our democracy and participate in our democracy. We're often coming at it from the wrong angle. And we should really be looking to these other countries who are instead come at it from the perspective of this is everybody's responsibility and everyone's expected to participate.
I think we have time for one last question, and we can go right there.
Do you see our democracy decreasing more in the near future?
Well, I think 2020 actually gives us a lot of hope that we might be in a moment where a lot more people are engaged. We saw record turnout in 2020, and so far in 2022, we've seen a high turnout. I think that this fight over voting rights is indicative of, how central this has become to our politics, is indicative of how much people care about our democracy right now. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people in that debate who are, in my view, taking the wrong approach and trying to make it harder to vote and attacking our democracy. But there's a lot on the other side of the equation, too. We talked about the expansive laws that are being passed in many states around the country. I think voters are really engaged with this idea of voting rights and democracy right now in a way that I don't know that they really ever have been before. This is a thing people care about, and people are turning out to the ballot box and voting. So this is a scary moment in some ways, but that's what I said when I said before about we have a decision to make collectively about which way we're going to go. There are a lot more people engaged with the pro-democracy side of things than I think have been for a long time too. This is a priority issue for voters in a way that it hasn't been before, and I'm hopeful that when we resolve that question, we resolve it the right way, and we're actually in a much healthier and better place than we've been in recent times. So I guess what I would say is I think we're in a really important moment right now where things could go one of two directions. We're in some ways sort of closer to heading down the road away from democracy than we've ever been, at least in my lifetime. But in other ways, we're potentially at the moment when the country rejects that road, where we could really be in a much healthier place for our democracy than we've been in a long time. And I didn't get into this earlier, but I referenced it, and so I do just want to say this. We think about this as a partisan issue a lot, and it is. There's no denying that, more than it ever has been before. When Bob Dole worked on the Voting Rights Act in 1982, it was a bipartisan issue. When it was renewed in 2006, it was a bipartisan issue, 98-0 vote in the U.S. Senate. It's not that anymore. It's a very partisan issue. That's unfortunate. But it isn't only partisan politics that's animating this conversation. And we looked at every single one of those restrictive voting laws that was introduced across the country, restrictive voting legislation introduced across the country in 2021. And we looked to see what's the pattern, what predicts where are these things are going to be introduced. Is it just party politics? Is it just that Republicans are introducing restrictive legislation and Democrats are introducing expansive legislation? Is it the more Republican the district, the more likely restrictive legislation will be introduced? And that divide does exist. As I said, it is a partisan issue. But what we found is over and above party, race predicts where restrictive legislation is going to be introduced. Restrictive bills were introduced by the whitest districts of the most diverse states. So Republican states that are controlled by Republicans in both houses of the legislature and in the governor's mansion, but that are very, very white, were actually less likely to be introducing restrictive legislation than the places where Republicans control, but there's a great deal of racial diversity. It was not only the districts where the whitest districts of the most diverse states were most likely to introduce legislation, it was also the districts with the highest levels of racial resentment where we're most likely to see restrictive legislation introduced. This fight that we're having right now is a fight about partisan politics. It is a fight about trying to maintain minority control, but it's not just a fight about partisan politics. That trying to maintain minority control is also about demographic shifts in our country and racial resentment and issues that we've never resolved as a country about race and related issues. And so I do think we have a real question about what decision we're going to make about democracy moving forward collectively. But I think in order to resolve that question, we need to be honest with ourselves about what that fight is really about. Is it a fight about whether or not we believe in democracy, or is it a fight about whether or not we believe in democracy when, I guess I should say it differently. You don't really believe in democracy unless you believe your side can lose. You don't really believe in democracy unless you're willing to accept that you might lose power if the majority is against you. And there are a lot of people right now that are grappling with whether they're okay with being in the minority in a democracy. And I think we have to answer the question that we are okay with that and we still want democracy. And that's the moment that we're faced with right now. And I just wanted to note that study because I think we often get caught up in this conversation as if it is a purely partisan conversation. But I think there's a lot more going on than partisan politics here. And we need to grapple with that if we want to come out on the right side of this question of whether or not we have a democracy in the United States.
Well, Sean, it's hard to imagine a more important topic to discuss. Thanks for doing that with us today. And I think everybody walks away with a lot more to think about than they walked in. So that's a service, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Just a reminder, we'll be back here next week. Scott Reed will be here to talk about the race for control of the Senate, which is interesting to say the least. Thank you all for coming out today. I hope you all make it back next week, same time, same place. Thanks.